Ready then? Okay, I'm just going to give, I'm not from this town, but I'm going to give you a little history because there's a connection between this town and where I used to work, which is Hormel, Iowa. And back in the 30s, Frank Ellis was what they used to call a packing house gypsy. Packing houses weren't organized, and they were people who stood in blood and guts all day were one of the low jobs in society. But Frank was an old wobbly, so he understood the wobbly tradition, but he also knew that wobblies got the shit beat out of them every time people knew that they were wobbly. So what he did was he kind of changed the name to Union of All Workers, UAW, but he used the wobbly philosophy of talking. And Frank was a skilled packing house worker, and so the skilled workers got kind of, well, they weren't the good jobs, but they were the better paying jobs, and you also were able to stay in the packing house longer because they wouldn't want those skilled people to go to elsewhere. And so Frank, when he got up, by the time he got up to here, because he started like down in Kansas, and he just kind of hopped through the packing houses up to Austin, and he would get, because during the winter time was a lot of layoffs, but he would get his friends into different departments in the plant, and they would, you would talk union, but you didn't talk too much there because that'd get you fired. But when it came time to get the workers united, with him having his people in the different departments, it was a lot easier to get them all out. And so when they finally did strike for recognition, they walked out, with him having his friends in the different places, they were able to get him out. And at that point in time, and without a whole lot of electricity, there was mostly the refrigeration of the meat was really critical, and it hanging very long, it would spoil. So if you had spoilage, then the governor would call the guard in, But the governor had gotten elected with a lot of labor votes, and Frank made sure that when they took over the plant that he kept the refrigerated departments cold so that the meat wouldn't spoil. So when the governor came in town and the company wanted him to bring the guard, he talked with Frank, and Frank said, no, there's no going to be no spoilage of meat, we just want recognition. So the governor at that point in time actually brought the guard in, but not to kick the strikers out, but to keep the strike breakers from going in. Because, and that was one of the ways that was different in what had been happening throughout the whole country. This is back in the 30s. So then the next strike was actually for a contract, and I can't remember, I don't know how long it lasted because I'm really not from here, but the reason why I knew Frank was in my local back home, we had a picture when they organized the union down there, and it was Frank Ellis that was talking to the crowd about the importance of organizing. And we were a local P-1, and this was P-9, and the P stood for packing house, and then the numbers was for the number of locals that got organized. So that was the first local in Ottumwa to get organized under the CIO. And Frank was, after he organized here under the UAW banner, he worked out through the whole Midwest in organizing, packing houses, Teamsters, and so he was instrumental in the whole Midwest in organizing a union, from the cities all the way down to Ottumwa, Cedar Rapids, far west, I believe, is Mitchell, South Dakota, and east into Madison, Wisconsin. So I mean, he was just fantastic. Now the owner at the time was Hormel, George or Jay, I'm not sure which, because Jay was his son. But they called, and when he recognized the union, they also put into place a program of profit sharing plan, and no packing house worker had shared in the profits. So they called Hormel the Red Capitalist because they were mad at him for sharing the profits with the workers. But what was significant about it is that it tied the workers to the plant, to the company, and they had a stake in it. and they would share in the profits. And it also kept, because packing house industry was, here today, gone tomorrow, but it kept people here. And so they never had another strike for 50 years until the 80s. And, but those workers with their deep roots of getting the first contract were also, through the years, would help anybody else. They didn't go out on strike. They didn't have that need, but they would, anybody else they would, and that's what this local became known as, is helping others. And then during the 80s, okay, then you had, in the industry, we had what became known as the Big Five and the Little Two. The Little Two was Hormel and Oscar Mayer. The Big Five, Morel. I can't remember all the names of the Big Five, but the vehicle that got established in packing was master agreements, which meant that all the philosophy of the union at that time, the CIO, was that everybody doing the same work, everybody gets the same pay. Whether you lived in Michigan or California. And so the CIO philosophy, the Big Five, the master agreements, what they did was they had what was called the packing house committee. So one worker and one officer from every packing house in the United States would attend the packing house committee, and then they would decide which company they were going to strike, and then the other ones would all support whoever was the one that was picked to be on strike. So we really turned the tables on the company, because the company now, when they're on strike, they don't have the shelf space, so then the other products get put in there, and so the workers were able to extract, basically their fair share from the companies. Okay, along came the 80s and late 70s and 80s, and the Big Five were decimated with bankruptcies and mergers. So Hormel actually became one of the bigger ones. Because you had Rath and Wilson and Morel were all either operating under, and the bankruptcy judges ruling that they could cut wages in those plants. So Hormel, even though they're making a profit, they used the Me Too clause to say, hey, if they're going to pay less, then we're going to pay less. Not because we can't afford it, but simply because we can. And that was, they instituted pay cuts. The workers voted to go on strike. But during the 70s and the 80s, the company had built a new plant, and they built, Tumwell was a new plant, and Tumwell was built to replace one of their other older plants, Fort Dodge. So the company had a lot of new plants, and they had old workers and old contracts. And they did their job in forcing a strike to, got rid of the old workers, got rid of the old contract, and got young workers that didn't have that union history, and a new contract that didn't have all those things that the company thinks binds them to work rules in the plant. They wanted to just be able to say, you go here, you go here, you go here on a daily basis. And so even though the strike here was a defeat because it was unconditional surrender, and it was taken over by the International Union. Because you also have to understand that in 1979 was a merger of unions. So the CIO philosophy, which was kept after the '65 merger of two unions, and the packing house committee that was kept, after the '79 merger, you started seeing the destruction of the packing house committee, which was the vehicle that got us what we had, and a change in the mentality of everybody doing the same work gets the same pay, to if they get 20 cents and you get a nickel, everybody at least got a raise. And that was the philosophy that kind of destroyed what we had. I mean, those are some of the vehicles in place that destroyed what we had. And we really haven't completely recovered since. Unfortunately, we're making gains. In our last contract,